Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our online webinar series hosted by National Sorghum Producers. This is a second part of a three-part series where we're covering the essentials of sorghum crop insurance, innovation, and some of the economic opportunities that lie ahead. So in this session, we will be talking about navigating double crop sorghum production and insurance. The basis for this webinar was after a recent update in the last year and a little bit to crop insurance policies by USDA RMA that National Sorghum Producers work to get. So we're going to take this opportunity to educate some of our growers about new options available to them. Like I said, this is the second of a three-part series. And if you are interested in going and watching that initial session, all of these webinars will be recorded and available at youtube.com/sorghumgrowers. Now, getting to our speakers for today, I have Chris Cogburn, who is Manager of Sustainable Crop Insurance Services, LP, and Brent Bean, the Agronomy Director for the Sorghum Checkoff. Chris draws on a background both as a farmer and a former sorghum board member. He has been with the National Sorghum Producers since 2005, and today he serves as our Senior Policy Advisor, as well as the Manager of Sustainable Crop Insurance Services, which is a subsidiary of NSP. Brent has worked as the Director of Agronomy for the Sorghum Checkoff for almost a decade. He previously spent 3 years as the Director of Agronomy for Next Step, where he led a team of agronomists in developing best management practices for sweet and biomass sorghum. Brent began his career serving as a Texas A&M AgriLife Research and Extension Center agronomist in the Texas Panhandle, focused on research and education efforts on developing best management practices for sorghum, corn, and wheat production. Now, before we get started, I wanted to show you where you can ask a question. Feel free to submit those questions as we go along, but we will have a Q&A session at the end of each speaker to be able to address questions about their presentation. If you look at the triangle, square, circle in the bottom right corner of your screen, there is the location to ask a question. And again, feel free to do that as long as we go along, and we will have sessions after each speaker to do that. At this time, I'm going to ask Brent Bean to come on to begin the presentation. We'll start with navigating double crop sorghum production. And with that, Brent, I will turn the controls over to you.
Okay, thank you, Jennifer. She did a nice job of introducing me, so I'm not going to go over any of that again. But on the screen, you see the outline of the subjects that I'm going to cover. We'll talk about planting date and growing season, early freeze damage, kind of what happens there, how cold temperatures need to get, and so on. We'll discuss hybrid selection, and then just the importance of soil, water, and rainfall. Seeding rate, which does need to change a little bit when you get into double cropping. Nitrogen, herbicide carryover, and then I'll have a slide on some other resources, and then hopefully have a few minutes for some questions that any of you may have. So, not surprisingly, what makes double cropping sorghum be successful? Pretty obvious. Length of growing season is going to be critical. That's going to certainly influence hybrid selection, and depending on the hybrid, that goes a long way to some extent on what kind of yield potential you potentially have. And then moisture is going to be critical. Most of this sorghum likely is going to be grown under dry land conditions, so moisture is going to be critical in the success of that crop. Of course, sorghum is its growth and development is driven by heat units, just like really all the other crops are. If you see on the slide there, the formula that is typically used is you take the maximum temperature, the minimum temperature for the day, get an average of that, and then subtract a base temperature. In this case, we're using 50, which is pretty standard. You'll see some Some formulas out there that people use a little bit different, where they may use 42 or 45 as the base, but for the most part, I think a base of 50 is what is used. The Kansas Mesonite net, for example, they use this particular formula when they're calculating their heat units. If you look there at the bottom of the slide, I've got two examples. If you have maximum temperatures of 95 and a minimum temperature of 75, that comes to a daily heat unit accumulation of 35, which is certainly good. And that's about the maximum you're typically going to get, say in end of June, 1st of July type weather that most of us are going to be experiencing. On the other hand, you get into late September, 1st of October, you very well may have a high of 75, a minimum of 56, and that gives you a heat unit total of 15. So the point here is a day in August 1st is not going to be the same in all likelihood as what you're going to get later on in the season. So those days early in the season are very valuable, and just I think shows the importance of planning as early as you possibly can, because you never know what's going to happen when you get later into the season. So just how cold does it need to get at the end of the season to cause a problem? This is some nice research that was done a few years ago. Of course, 32 is freezing point, but really for that plant tissue to die and be killed, it's got to get colder than that. So you might think 30 is enough. Well, you see on the chart there, maybe a little bit, but really it takes a temperature of less than 28, and then that temperature needs to stay there for 2 hours. So that's kind of the point where we really start getting into some significant yield loss when that happens. And so that's what we've kind of got to watch for there. So we're at the end of the season. You're trying to get that crop matured on out. How much does it cost you in yield depending on the growth stage of that sorghum? And that's what this chart shows. So from the time of that sorghum has bloomed to reaching physiological maturity, in a normal planting date, we typically talk about 45, maybe as many as 50 days to reach maturity, physiological maturity. In a double crop situation, that certainly can change because of those cooler temperatures you get at the end of the season. But if you look at the growth stages here, at hard dough stage, of course, that's when you cannot squeeze that kernel anymore between your fingers when it's hard. If you had a hard freeze, again, below 28 degrees for, in this case, 4 hours, this chart is showing a 27% yield loss. So that's pretty significant. At that point, you're still looking at, roughly 15 to 18 days to reach maturity at that hard dough stage. But notice as that chart goes down, I've got in this example, hard dough to late dough, that's 3 days. Well, again, that's kind of ideal conditions. But that grain is changing a lot in a very short period of time. So this just, I think, stresses the importance of a day and how much that can affect yield at the end of the year if you get that freeze just a couple of days later. Again, it kind of goes back to the importance of planting just as early as you possibly can, where you can count on those heat units. So certainly this is going to drive hybrid selection to some extent, how much growing season you have left. Typically the hybrids that we're using with sorghum are 90 to 125 days in maturity from planting date. A lot of guys in the sorghum belt are using medium or medium early maturing varieties. Those are going to require normally 100 to 110 days to reach maturity. Again, that's with an early planting or an optimum planting type date. What I like to do in determining what hybrid I'm going to plant is add up those days that you've got. So say you're going to plant, in this example that I've got here, June 25th, and we're assuming we're going to have that hard freeze October 20th. That gives you 117 days. Well, that sounds pretty good. But again, those days at the end of the season aren't going to be worth as much from a heat unit standpoint. So To be conservative, I like to subtract 10 days from that. So that's going to give me 107 days. So that's what I'm looking at in this particular example, if I'm going to, when I think I can, in choosing my hybrid. And so keep that, keep that in mind. Again, a little bit of most of the company brochures on a seed hybrid, they're going to tell you how many days it takes to reach maturity, or at least they're going to give you a days to flowering. And again, if it's listed to days to flowering, typically you can add 45 days or so to that to reach physiological maturity. Volunteer wheat. So if you're double cropping, one reason that you may be doing that is because something happened to your wheat crop. And that could be a hail or who knows what, but you end up with a lot of seed on the ground, which can lead to a volunteer wheat problem. Historically, we haven't had a way to really control that volunteer wheat very well. With some of these new technologies we now have for grass, and there's 3 of them, there's Double Team, iGrowth, and Enzen. This allows us to use grass herbicides. So you have to plant in this case, we'll use Double Team as an example, a Double Team hybrid. You can control very well that volunteer grass with First Act, which is the herbicide you would use in that case. More than likely, it'll be Double Team or iGrowth, because the hybrids that are available with Enzen, in fact, there's only one of them available. It's more of a medium full maturing variety. And in most cases, that maturity is just going to be too long for Double Team. But we do have an answer for volunteer wheat with these new technologies now. Moisture. Clearly, that's going to be the key. Most time, you're not going to even be considering a double crop unless you have good, good soil moisture. Which means you need to know really what your soil texture is. And of course, most of you are going to know what your soil texture is. But then how does that translate into soil moisture? This chart or this table kind of outlines that. For example, if you have a fine sandy loam soil, this is telling you you're going to have 1.5 to 2 inches of available soil water per foot. So if you've got 3 foot of moisture, or you can probe that ground and you can stick that probe in the ground 3 foot, that's a good indication. You may have up to 6 inches of available water. That's going to go a long way in making that double crop. And so that's going to be critical, I think, in just really determining if you should even plant a double crop. And then also gives you an idea of how much rain you're going to need if you don't have that. So just something that's important to know going into that decision making on whether you're going to plant a double crop sorghum. Seed recommendation. So this chart that I'm showing, or this table, this is what we recommend for normal planting. You can take a look at that and see if that's kind of in line with what you're using. But this is typically what we recommend. There's a pretty good range there. Sorghum has a unique ability when planted early to be able to either tiller or just to make that head bigger, more grain per head. And so there's a lot of elasticity, if you will. So there's in this particular example, if you planted 50,000 seed per acre, that's good for 90 to as much as 145 bushels or so of grain, even more under the right conditions because of that flexibility or the elasticity that sorghum has. Unfortunately, with late planted sorghum, that's not the case as much. This is an old slide, but a very good slide. Most of you have probably seen people present this data before, but if you look at that June 29th planting date, so this would be a late planting. This is 30, 60, and 90,000 plants in this case. So you can look at it maybe a sitting rate if you want to in this case. But that on the top of that bar, that yellow represents the amount of grain from tillering. Okay, so the point is, the later you get in the season, the less tillering you have. And so you need to compensate for that with seeding rate when it comes to double crop. And so really what I recommend is that you increase that seeding rate 20 to 30% compared to what you maybe would do under your optimum planting date situation, because you've just got to again, overcome that lack of tillering. If you get into a situation where you're planting one of these really quick maturing hybrids, so we talked about earlier, those, that early to medium maturity varieties, you can plant that, 95 to 105 days or so to maturity. If you want to plant a very quick maturing hybrid, it may mature in 90 days. But what you're giving up with those very quick early maturing hybrids is really going to be the size of that head. It's not going to tiller. And so to make up for the size of that head or more kernels per head, you've got to increase your seeding rate. So in that case, I would at least do that 30%, maybe even more if I have really good moisture and I'm planting a very early or short maturing hybrid. Nitrogen. This really doesn't change compared to what you would normally be using for sorghum. Different states use different formulas, but roughly it's 2 pounds of N for every 100 pounds of grain, or 1.1 pound of N per expected bushel. What I think is kind of key on the double crop, especially if maybe something happened to that wheat crop and it just didn't, maybe you lost it early in the season, fairly early, and that wheat crop just didn't use a lot of nitrogen. You need to take that into account, okay? And really, what I would think about doing is using a starter fertilizer and maybe not putting any nitrogen on up front or prior to planting. There's plenty of data that shows that sorghum responds very well to in-season nitrogen application, even as late as 45 days. And so that's what I would do in a lot of situations with double crop when you're really not quite sure what that crop is going to do. But I would use a starter and then just plan, depending on how the sorghum is doing, what kind of rains I've gotten, and so forth, on how much more nitrogen I'm going to put on. But I really would use that starter fertilizer, okay, to get, of course, those soil temperatures are warm at that point, so it's going to germinate. It should come up fairly quickly. But what this particular slide shows is just how that starter fertilizer, when you have both N and P particularly, and that'd be represented by that blue bar or the purple bar there, how much quicker it can mature. And since we're planting late anyway, if you can get just even just 4 or 5 days, as we showed earlier, it can make a big difference in the potential for that yield and dodging that late freeze. So I would always try to use a starter. And then again, from a fertilizer standpoint, just come back, later on in season and apply whatever else you think you need to make that, to get to that yield potential. Herbicide carryover, clearly this is something you've got to pay attention to, again, especially if it's following wheat. Probably the more common herbicides you'll run into are amber, finesse, and ally, but basically something that has metsulfuron in it is what you're watching for. What I've seen over the years, really, if you've got metsulfuron, finesse, or ally, especially ally, usually you can get by, especially if you've had some significant rains and that ally was put on fairly early, but there is a risk associated with that, and you need to be aware of that. The other products that you may run into, Olympus, Outrider, Beyond Extra, those certainly can be an issue if you happen to have used those particular herbicides in your wheat. So just pay attention and know what you may run into from a soil residual standpoint with your herbicides. Other sources, on our website, I maintain a site called Agronomy Insights. There's probably 50 or 60 different topics on that page, or that particular page of our website. These are all fairly short, page and a half, maybe 2 pages at the most on particular topics. 3 of those topics have to do with double cropping. And so I think there's hopefully some good information there you can use. And there's, of course, Kansas State and others have some good resources there, and you can see a couple of publications from Kansas State that you could fall back on and take a look at if you need some more information. So with that, Jennifer, I'd be glad to take any questions.
Thank you, Dr. Bean, for that information. And so if you have questions for Dr. Bean, you can submit those now. Again, if you look on your screen, the triangle, square, circle in the bottom right corner is the location where you should be able to ask questions. I also, as we're waiting on those, I also did drop that link into the comment box of the Agronomy Insights website location at the Sorghum Checkoff website that Dr. Bean also mentioned. We don't have any questions right now, but if we do get some, we can always circle back to those at the end of the presentation as well. Wait just a minute here, and if not, we will move on to our next speaker. And Chris is online.
Yes, I am.
All right. Well, Chris, I am not seeing any questions in right now for Dr. Bean, but again, feel free to submit those as you've had a little bit more time to think about them, and we can always wrap back up to those at the end of the session, and maybe something that Chris talks about will spark a question related to the production side. But with that, I will turn it over to you, Chris, to present about insurance options with double crop.
Okay. Well, appreciate everybody online, and we're going to give a little bit of history and then kind of go through where we're at today with double crop grain sorghum. And RMA kind of made this push starting in 23. And, you know, when you look back before 23, really, you had Osage County, Oklahoma, and you had the Missouri Boot Hill counties. That's the only place we really had non-irrigated FAC, which in RMA world, that stands for following a crop. So double crop. So we had non-irrigated FAC before the 23 changes. You just had those few counties, and that was it. And then everything's kind of changed since then. And like I said, our backdrop is actually a 25 map, but I'll start pointing out things as we kind of go through here. And another thing, and this kind of ties back to Brent's discussion on, you know, trying to get stuff in early, you know, plant dates for crop insurance. You know, we have a final plant date that's published for a particular county practice, as well as a late plant period, which is in the slide, you'll see that as LPP. And so for Osage, Oklahoma, you know, following a crop, that's a 7-5 plant date, which means if you get it in by 7-5, it's 100%. And you have late plant period goes to 7-10. So your guarantee would go down 1% a day during those 5 days. And that 1% reduction per day, that's standard across all grain sorghum. So it's not going to matter what county we're looking at or anything like that. Your Boot Hill counties, they're 6-10, and their late plant period goes all the way to 7-5. And that's where, like I said, this was all in place before the 23 changes. Now, what happened, 23 had a lot of written agreements come in. We're not going to cover those because they will cover part of that, but that really, your big change about getting to standard practices happened in 24. And that one was, you'll see these purple counties on the west side of the sorghum belt in Texas, Oklahoma, and Kansas. You know, we had irrigated FAC. We got that added in 24, which means that we have following the crop, but in these western counties, it's only for irrigated. So your non-irrigated still can't do double crop, but irrigated we can. And for planting dates, of course, Kansas, the whole state, it's 6-25. Late plant period goes to 7-20. Oklahoma, 6-30. Late plant period goes to 7-10. And then you get down to Texas. Panhandle area where we do have irrigated double crop, 630. Down here, the Rolling Plains, those few counties there that have irrigated, FAC 515. And then down here in the Winter Garden, that's 415. And you have a 10-day late plant period on all of those in Texas. So again, Texas has multiple final plant dates. Late plant period, though, in all of Texas is 10 days. So now this strip of counties here includes Nebraska down through Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas. This is what you're going to be looking at to do history. You need 3 years of history to do a non-irrigated written agreement. And that is pretty well not changed. This strip of counties has been really consistent. When RMA rolled this out in 23, that if you wanted to look at doing that, it's going to be 3 years of history. That'll be a written agreement. That'll be a TP type. And we'll talk a little bit about written agreements later, but that would be this strip of counties. Nebraska, no different than others, but you got 615 final plant with a 710 late plant period. And all the other states that you're going to see, Texas, of course, will be different, but Oklahoma and Kansas will be the same as their regular sorghum, whether it's written agreement or not. Now, this block of counties, the next one over, this is what is going to take 2 years of history. And because of the changes that happened this year, which will affect Kansas, now you're only looking at this 2-year history block being either in Oklahoma or in Texas. Same deal as the 3-year strip. This will be a TP written agreement, but would require 2 years of history growing sorghum to be able to start applying for that written agreement. And then you have these counties then over in Oklahoma, just over further east from the 2-year, that we have what they call a blanket written agreement available. Now, interesting note on the blanket written agreement ones, which you have Oklahoma and Texas have some of these counties. That means if you apply by sales closing, which would be 315 up Oklahoma and the upper part of Texas, then you get down to Texas, you're going to have different sales closing dates. But if you apply for that blanket written agreement, that means it's going to happen. You just literally, it's a 1-page form with your crop insurance agent, fill it out. You'd be able to get non-irrigated double crop coverage. Now, if you wanted to kind of wait on that, you could do again, the TP, do that by acreage reporting date, if that's your initial application for that written agreement. And then this is where we get into the big changes for 25. And what happened here in 25, RMA, if we'd have looked at this map last year in 24, all this stuff in blue in Kansas over into Missouri, it would have been down here in this blanket written agreement color, because last year the blanket written agreement included Kansas and Missouri as well as what we have in Texas and Oklahoma. But now what RMA's done for 25 is this non-irrigated is now a standard practice. It's an FAC. And what that means is you no longer have to worry about a written agreement, but if you're going to be planting non-irrigated double crop, it will be insurable. And it's going to have to be insured because now it is a standard practice listed in the actuarials. So that is, like I said, that's the big change. In talking with RMA out of Topeka, and Topeka RMA oversees Missouri, Kansas, Colorado, and Nebraska. So that's their 4 states that cover out that regional office. They received over 1,000 blanket written agreement requests last year. And when you receive that many blanket written agreement requests, you're going to end up making it a standard practice. And that's what they did. That's just so many that office is trying to handle. Now, Oklahoma City RO, which covers Texas, New Mexico, Oklahoma, they receive very few blanket written agreement requests, and they right now are just going to leave it as the blanket written agreement. It did not go as a standard practice down here in Oklahoma or Texas, but we sure did up in Kansas and Missouri. And again, just to go back to our plant dates, because even though it's now a standard practice, they did not change the plant dates like you might see down like here in Osage, where the FAC has got a little different plant date than non-FAC. Again, for Kansas, you're still looking at 625, 720. Missouri is 620 and 715, except for Ripley, which they moved it. It's now the same plant date as your Missouri Boot Hill, which had double crop, back before the 23 changes. So Ripley now is the same time as your Boot Hill counties, and that's 610 and 75, and 75 being the end of the late plant period. Now, again, as we were talking about, your blanket versus your TP written agreements. Again, blanket, one-page form, you fill it out by sales closing. You're obligated to cover the double crop acres if you plant them. And like I said, this is what we still have now for Texas and Oklahoma is the blanket. If you don't decide to do that by sales closing, then it's going to roll over to what we call a TP, which means type practice written agreement. That's traditional written agreement, requires a little more work. It's more cumbersome. You have to get agronomic support letter. It's more what you'd call a full-blown written agreement application. That has to be done by acreage reporting for your initial written agreement. And there's some differences on the AIPs on how quick that has to be in from your agent to the AIP, but don't wait acreage reporting. If you have that double crop planted and want to cover it, get that done. Also realize on a TP that if that's planted when you apply for the written agreement, it will have to be inspected by an adjuster. Blanket written agreement, no inspection required because you're doing it way before you plant. If you do a TP, you don't have to insure those double crop acres unless you actually sign the acceptance offer from RMA. So little different there compared to versus the blanket written agreement. If you're somebody using enterprise units or EI, which is enterprise by irrigation practice, and you do a written agreement, whether blanket or TP, those FAC acres are going to be on the same enterprise as your non-FAC acres. So just be aware of that. They will not keep them separate. They're going to be in the same enterprise unit as your non-FAC acres if you do a written agreement. Now, switching over to those standard FAC practices, which we have now in Kansas and Missouri. First of all, like I said, it's got to be insured if you planted it. I mean, that's just the way it is. That's now a published actuarial practice. You cannot divide your OUBU by FAC and FAC. So if you're doing optional or basic units, is that your unit structure for your crop insurance policy? Those FAC and MFEC acres are going to be in the same OUBU. And if you have, and we've got a slide coming up that kind of gives that a little demonstration, but those are going to be the same in the same unit. So they're going to take the total production from the two different fields, or if they're in the same unit, and that's going to be used to calculate whether you have an indemnity. Now, they may have different APHs, depending on your histories, but that is all going to be summed together to determine if you have an indemnity coming off that particular OU or BU. Now, what FSA does allow you to do, though, is you can do enterprise by crop practice, which if you're looking at, from a crop insurance standpoint, we love acronyms. That acronym is EC when you're filling out your option code on an application. That's enterprise by crop practice. And this you can split up and do NFAC, which is your non-double crop, that's not following a crop. You could have it in a separate enterprise or do it as OUBU, and then you could do your double crop, your FAC in enterprise, or do it OUBU. You can mix and match those. Now, the one thing you can't do is you can't combine this with EI, because you can't generate 4 separate enterprise units. In other words, you can't have irrigated double crop, irrigated non-double crop, dry land double crop, and then dry land regular. You can't do that. You've got to choose either EI or EC if you're going to be looking at doing something. If you've got irrigation and double crop both involved, you can't have those together. You're going to have EI or EC. EC does not work with the multi-county option or enterprise by irrigation, which is EI. It does. Right now, RMA has not allowed EC to work with multi-county. So, if you're familiar with multi-county, if you have an enterprise in one county and you've got one unit over here by itself in a separate county, as long as that county is contiguous, you can make them all into one big enterprise unit. You can do that with EI, but you cannot right now do it with EC. Again, that's just one of the restrictions on EC. The other thing about EC, like any other policy option, it's going to have to be on your policy by sales closing for EC to apply if you want to look at doing enterprise by crop practice. And just kind of give y'all, to sum this up, some different slides on units. If you did optional units for both NFAC and FAC, like we talked about, you can't subdivide them. So in our section here, section 7 and section 8, we have a field of each. You take the total amount of production guarantee and you're going to subtract the actual amount that was totally harvested and figuring on revenue price. Again, all that's going to be used to determine if you've got a loss on OU 101 and then OU 102. Again, they're going to be added together because they cannot be further subdivided for FAC and NFAC. They're all going to be, the section overrules it all. That's basically the key. You can't subdivide inside that. Now, if you want to start bringing in EC, in this example here, the producer decided to do EC on both NFAC and FAC. So you're basically at 2 separate enterprise units. The NFAC here and the NFAC over here, going to be a total there. And then your EU, same way. EU, FAC, that's going to bring in both stuff from section 7 and section 8. Again, would not matter if you're in a situation there, if let's say one of these NFACs is irrigated over here in section 7 and everything else is dry land, it's not going to matter. If you're doing EC, and this is what you chose, that section 7, that irrigated NFAC is going to be used along with the non-irrigated NFAC over here in section 8. Look at that enterprise unit. So if that's the case, maybe what you want to do there is our slide here. Let's say if that's the case, let's say your section 7 is irrigated and section 8 is dry land for NFAC. We want to put them in an optional unit. So if that's the case, you're going to have option unit 101, option unit 102. Those NFACs will be kept separate. They're not going to be combined to enterprise. And then we're talking about basically all this is the dry land stuff over in the eastern side of Kansas, over into Missouri. This FAC is all dry land. You could put it into an enterprise unit. That might save you some premium for sure by putting an enterprise unit, but still keep your irrigated NFAC and your non-irrigated NFAC, kept them separate in optional units. Again, some flexibility you can do with the EC on your policy. So that's something to be aware of, because like I said, we can't mix EI and EC, but we can keep the EC there if you want to try to separate your NFACs between irrigated and non-irrigated. You might want to leave them as OU, put EC, and have it applied to your FAC. So something to think about if you're in that situation. Like I said, Best thing you can do is, if you're talking about doing a written agreement, don't surprise your crop insurance agent because it takes a little time. Blanket written agreements are easy. Like I said, one pager, fill it out when you're doing the sales app. By 3:15, you can do it at the same time anyway. Pretty simple. A TP takes a little more time, so don't surprise your crop insurance agent. Give them a heads up, kind of what you're wanting to do. Y'all can look at some options, and if it's a fit, if you're in a blanket written agreement area. Now, if you're in one of the new areas in Kansas and Missouri that has gone now to full FAC on the non-irrigated, talk with your agent about your options. Do you want to do EC? Do you want to do EC on that? And then if you've got some irrigation, keep your NFAC sorghum, keep it optional maybe. But get a game plan, visit. And like I said, if you're not too familiar with enterprise units, but you think maybe I want to do that on my FAC, get a good quote because it will definitely save you some premium on enterprise compared to OUBU. So that's kind of what we're going to look at on crop insurance, and be happy to have any questions come in. We'll answer them.
Thank you, Chris. Just wanted to point out on the question and answer, it looks like some people on mobile may be having an issue accessing that Q&A feature. So at the top of your screen, you'll see a link that you can also go to submit questions. So if you're having issues, feel free to use that option to submit a question. We do have one question, Chris. The question is, does the blanket written agreement mean you can automatically insure a FAC sorghum crop with no previous history for a given field? If so, is the county T yield used for historical yield on that field?
Okay. Yeah. If you're in an area where you've got blanket written agreements available, you don't have to have any history, and they will give you a T yield back from RMA on your blanket written agreements. It's going to be the same whether you do the blanket or do the TP. It's going to be the same T yield. It will usually be, it's hard to say. It depends on the county. It may be 5% less than the standard T yield. It may be 10%. That's going to depend on the county. But you would, RMA, we were at an update meeting last week, and they're working on getting out the spreadsheet that has what the blanket written agreement T yields are going to be in those counties. I haven't seen it yet, but I would say you're going to have that out. I would say within a week or two. And if you're in a 3:15 sales closing area, you're going to have plenty of time to decide if that's what you want to do. But that will be a standard number put out by RMA.
I don't see any other questions at this time, but there's still time to submit those. While we are waiting to see if there are any other questions, I am going to let you know about our next webinar, which is the final webinar in this series. It's session 3, where Chris Cogburn will be back to go over some of the simplifications made to the sorghum silage policy, especially the removal of the 2-year history requirement for insuring irrigated sorghum silage. He'll also cover the use of annual forage for non-irrigated sorghum silage in counties where MPCI is not an option or where sorghum silage is not offered in the actuarials. And again, that webinar is next Tuesday, so a week from today. And I'm sorry, the time is not to be announced. It is the same time, 12:30 Central. A follow-up question, Chris. Is the blanket written agreement in the Western counties purple band only apply to irrigated FAC?
No, the purple in the Western counties for irrigated only, that's a standard practice. So it's going to be in the Western counties, that purple is now a standard FAC for irrigated only. So if you're going to do irrigated double crop, it's going to be covered. It'll have to be insured just like your regular irrigated insurance. There's no written agreement needed on the Western side.
And I think we can also go back to that map if that's helpful to look at again.
Just back it up. And yeah, this purple over here on the west, like I said, that's no written agreement required. That's irrigated only. Now, again, you can't even, they're not going to even look at a non-irrigated written agreement request. That's just this, they don't want them. But on the irrigated, there's no written agreement required. That irrigated, it's completely insurable right now as a double crop.
I don't see any other questions right now, Chris, but we'll see if there's some others before we come to an end here. I did want to let you know if you did have trouble with the Q&A or anything like that, Chris and Brent's emails are here. If you do have some follow-up questions, feel free to shoot them a message. I know they'd be happy to answer you. We also would welcome your feedback if you want to scan the QR code and let us know how this webinar did for you guys, as well as information about our website and phone number there at the office. With that, I'm not seeing any other questions coming in right now, but thank you everyone for attending this webinar. Like I said, it will be recorded and up on our YouTube page. That's youtube.com/sorghum growers. If you want to go back and reference any of the material. Thank you for joining us, and we hope we will see some of you for our next webinar next week. Thank you all.